Sometimes the wilderness calls back to those who've wronged it, and the debt must be paid in full. High in the Cascade Mountains, where cell towers can't reach and civilization feels like a distant memory, Ezra Blackwood pressed his weathered binoculars against the frosted window of his cabin. For 15 years, these mountains had been his sanctuary, a place where a man could disappear from the mistakes that haunted him. But what he saw through that swirling December storm made his blood run cold. 20 wolves, moving in perfect formation around a distant cabin. Not hunting, not prowling, waiting. Ezra had spent his life studying predators before everything went wrong, before the accident that destroyed his family and career. He knew wolf behavior like his own heartbeat. This wasn't natural. Wolves didn't gather in packs this large, didn't move with such eerie precision, and they certainly didn't perform what looked like some ancient ritual around human dwellings. The woman in that cabin, he'd glimpsed her through his scope before, a young researcher who shouldn't be alone in these mountains. What was she doing that commanded such loyalty from creatures that weren't supposed to exist here? As the storm intensified, Ezra faced a choice that would drag him from his self-imposed exile into a mystery that connected to the very tragedy he'd been running from. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ezra lowered the binoculars with trembling fingers, his breath fogging the cabin's single window. The storm had been building for 3 days, and he'd watched it approach with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read nature's moods like scripture. But this defied everything he understood about the natural order. He stepped back from the window, his boots creaking against the worn pine floorboards. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as memories he'd spent years burying clawed their way to the surface. 20 wolves. The number echoed in his mind like a death knell, dragging him back to another December, another storm, another moment when he'd stared in disbelief at something that shouldn't exist. The coffee mug in his weathered hands had gone cold hours ago. Ezra set it down on the scarred wooden table beside his field journals, 15 years' worth of meticulous observations about everything except the one subject that mattered. He'd documented every bird migration, every seasonal change, every natural phenomenon in these mountains. Everything except the truth about why he'd really come here. Outside, the wind howled through the Douglas firs with a voice that sounded almost human, almost pleading. Ezra forced himself back to the window. The distant cabin, barely visible through the swirling snow, sat in a clearing about 3 miles northeast. He'd first noticed it 6 months ago when smoke began rising from its chimney. Before that, the place had been abandoned for as long as he could remember. Then she'd arrived. Dr. Sarah Chen. He'd learned her name from the supply drops he sometimes witnessed through his scope, packages marked with university labels that told him she was legitimate, at least on paper, young, maybe early 30s, with long black hair she kept tied back in a practical ponytail. She moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who belonged there, which had impressed him initially. Most researchers who ventured this deep into the Cascades lasted a few weeks before the isolation drove them back to civilization. But Sarah had stayed. Even as autumn turned to winter and the access roads became impassable, she'd remained. Ezra had watched her splitting firewood, checking weather instruments, taking samples from the nearby creek. Normal research activities. Nothing that would explain why 20 extinct wolves now circled her cabin like sentinels. He raised the binoculars again, adjusting the focus with practiced precision. The wolves hadn't moved. They maintained their perfect formation, a ring of shadow and fur that defied every instinctual behavior pattern he'd ever studied. Wolves were social creatures, yes, but this wasn't pack behavior. This was something else entirely, something choreographed. The lead wolf, a massive grey-black creature at least twice the size of any wolf he'd encountered in his former life, sat directly facing Sarah's front door. Its posture spoke of infinite patience, as if it could wait there until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. The others, varying shades of silver, brown, and charcoal, formed concentric circles around the cabin. None of them panted despite the cold. None of them fidgeted or showed signs of restlessness. They simply waited. Ezra's scientific mind, dormant for so many years, began cataloguing impossibilities. First, the Cascade wolf population had been declared extinct in the 1940s. Second, even if a remnant pack had somehow survived undetected, 20 individuals would represent an unprecedented gathering. Third, their behavior violated every documented pattern of lupine social structure. And fourth, the detail that made his hands shake as he gripped the binoculars, he was certain he'd seen that lead wolf before. 15 years ago, in a laboratory in Seattle, in the moments before his world ended. The storm surge hit the cabin like a physical blow, rattling the windows and sending loose snow spiraling past the glass. For a moment, his view of the distant scene was completely obscured. When it cleared, something had changed. The woman, Sarah, stood in her doorway now. Even at this distance, even through the storm, Ezra could see her clearly. She wore no coat, no protection against the sub-zero wind. She simply stood there, her arms at her sides, looking out at the circle of wolves. And they looked back. What happened next made Ezra's breath catch in his throat. Sarah raised one hand, a small, deliberate gesture, and every wolf in the circle turned their head in perfect unison toward the northeast, toward his cabin, toward him. 20 pairs of eyes locked onto his position across 3 miles of wilderness and swirling snow. The lead wolf rose to its feet with fluid grace, its massive head tilted as if listening to something only it could hear. Ezra stumbled backward from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. They couldn't possibly see him at this distance, not through the storm. It was impossible. But as he pressed himself against the far wall of his cabin, one certainty crystallized in his mind like ice forming on still water. His 15 years of hiding were over. Whatever he'd tried to escape in those Seattle laboratories had found him, and it was hungry for answers he wasn't sure he was ready to give. Ezra remained pressed against the cabin wall for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his pulse thundering in his ears louder than the storm outside. When he finally forced himself to look through the window again, the wolves were gone. The distant clearing showed only wind-whipped snow and the faint glow of Sarah's cabin windows. He slumped into the wooden chair beside his table, suddenly aware of how quiet his world had become. For 15 years, this silence had been his sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap. The morning routine that had anchored his days for over a decade beckoned with desperate familiarity. Coffee first, real coffee, not the instant stuff most mountain dwellers settled for. He'd invested in a hand-crank grinder and French press, small luxuries that connected him to the man he'd once been. The ritual of measuring beans, heating water on his wood stove, timing the steep, it had always centered him. Today, his hands shook as he worked. While the coffee brewed, Ezra opened his weather journal. Every morning at 0700 hours, he recorded temperature, humidity, wind direction, precipitation. 15 years of data filled identical notebooks, stacked in chronological order on his bookshelf. Temperature, -12 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind, northwest, gusting to 40 miles per hour. Precipitation, heavy snow, accumulation 8 to 10 inches overnight. He paused at the remarks section. What was the protocol for documenting the impossible? The radio crackled from its perch on the windowsill, his only connection to the outside world. Every morning at 0730, Bill Hutchins checked in from the ranger station 40 miles east. Bill thought Ezra was just another mountain hermit, a burned-out academic who'd chosen solitude over society. The truth was simpler and more complicated. Ezra Blackwood was a dead man who'd forgotten to stop breathing. "Morning, Blackwood. You still breathing up there?" Bill's voice fought through the static. Ezra reached for the handset, grateful for human contact that didn't involve extinct predators with impossible intelligence. "Still here, Bill. Storm's picking up. Yeah, we're tracking it. Should blow through by tomorrow afternoon. You need anything?" This was their dance. Bill offered help. Ezra politely declined. The ranger knew about Ezra's supply runs to the small town of Cedar Falls, his twice-yearly trips for medical checkups, his carefully maintained independence. What Bill didn't know was that Dr. Ezra Blackwood, former lead researcher at the Pacific Northwest Wildlife Institute, former husband, former father, had died in a Seattle laboratory fire that killed 17 people and destroyed 40 years of groundbreaking research. The man who answered the radio was just someone wearing his name. "I'm good for another month," Ezra replied. "Thanks for checking. Roger that. Stay warm." The radio fell silent, leaving Ezra alone with the weight of what he'd witnessed. He opened his current field journal, not the weather log, but the personal one where he recorded his real observations. The pages chronicled a careful, contained existence, bird migrations, seasonal plant changes, the slow adaptation of a former scientist to a life deliberately stripped of its former meaning. He'd chosen this exile after the fire. Insurance money and a modest pension allowed him to disappear into the mountains, to become someone who existed without consequence. No relationships to destroy through his failures. No students depending on his expertise. No colleagues trusting his judgment. No family left to lose. The isolation had been medicine at first. Days without speaking to another human. Weeks defined by the simple needs of survival. Firewood, food, shelter maintenance. Seasons marked only by natural rhythms instead of academic calendars or research deadlines. He'd learned to find peace in small things. The first spring wildflowers. The satisfaction of a well-maintained cabin. The deep sleep that came from physical exhaustion rather than chemical aids. But lately, the peace felt brittle. 6 months ago, when Sarah Chen had first appeared in the distant cabin, Ezra had felt something he'd thought extinct. Curiosity. Not just scientific interest, but genuine human wonder about another person's presence in his carefully controlled world. He'd watched her through his binoculars with growing fascination. The way she moved through the wilderness, her obvious competence, her stubborn persistence in staying through the brutal mountain winter. For the first time in 15 years, he'd wondered what it might be like to have a conversation that went beyond weather reports and supply needs. Now that curiosity felt like a curse. Ezra closed the journal without writing anything. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. By evening, he'd be snowed in for days, trapped with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered and memories he'd spent years learning to suppress. He settled into his afternoon routine of equipment maintenance, cleaning his rifle and checking his emergency supplies. But every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the northeast, toward the clearing where something impossible had happened. The wolves were gone, but they'd left something behind, the certainty that his carefully constructed exile was about to collapse. Whatever Sarah Chen was really doing in that cabin, it was connected to his past. And after 15 years of hiding from the consequences of his choices, those consequences had finally tracked him down. The question wasn't whether he'd investigate. The question was whether he was strong enough to face what he might find. The decision came at 3:47 a.m., torn from sleep by a sound that shouldn't exist. Howling. Not the coyote yips Ezra had grown accustomed to over the years, but something deeper. Something that resonated in his chest like a tuning fork struck against bone. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to voices that belonged to creatures supposedly extinct for 80 years, and felt the last of his carefully constructed denial crumble. The howls weren't random. They formed a pattern, call and response, harmonies that spoke of intelligence and intention. As he counted the distinct voices, Ezra's scientific mind couldn't help but catalogue what he heard, 20 individuals, just as he'd witnessed through the binoculars. But now they were singing, and they were closer, much closer. Ezra slipped from bed and padded to the window in his thermal underwear, rifle in hand. The storm had intensified during the night, transforming his world into a wall of horizontal snow. Visibility was maybe 20 yards, but the howling seemed to come from everywhere at once, north, south, circling his cabin in the same impossible formation he'd observed around Sarah's place. His breath fogged the glass as he peered into the whiteout, searching for shapes that might or might not be there. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the wind's monotonous shriek. The silence felt worse than the howling. Then he saw the tracks. Even through the driving snow, the prints were unmistakable. Wolf tracks, impossibly fresh despite the blizzard that should have filled them within minutes. They circled his cabin in a perfect ring, just like the creatures had circled Sarah's. But these tracks told a different story, one that made Ezra's hands shake as he traced their path with his eyes. The prints were too large, too deep, and in several places they seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence that had nothing to do with reflected moonlight. Ezra dressed quickly, pulling on layers with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd learned that hesitation in sub-zero temperatures could be fatal. Thermal layers, wool sweater, down jacket, waterproof shell, boots rated for 40 below, gloves that wouldn't interfere with trigger control. He'd learned to prepare for anything the mountains might throw at him. He hadn't learned to prepare for this. The wind tried to tear the cabin door from his hands as he stepped outside. Snow stung his exposed face like needles, but he forced himself to examine the tracks more closely. What he found made his scientific worldview buckle under the weight of impossibility. The prints weren't just large, they were anatomically wrong. Too wide through the pad, with claw marks that extended too far forward, and the stride length suggested creatures moving with a gait no earthly wolf had ever possessed. But most disturbing was what he found at the cabin's northeast corner, where the track circle was broken by a single line of prints leading away into the storm, leading toward Sarah Chen's cabin. Ezra stood in the howling darkness, snow accumulating on his shoulders, and felt the weight of a choice he'd been avoiding for 15 years. He could retreat to his cabin, lock the door, and pretend this was all some stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many years of isolation. He could maintain his exile, his careful disconnection from anything that might demand courage or consequence, or he could follow the tracks. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive in these mountains, screamed against venturing into a blizzard to chase phantoms. But another part, the scientist he'd tried so hard to bury, whispered that some discoveries were worth any risk, that some questions demanded answers regardless of the personal cost. As he stood there, paralyzed between fear and curiosity, his satellite phone buzzed against his chest. The display showed an unknown number, which was impossible. Only 3 people had this number: Bill Hutchins, his doctor in Cedar Falls, and the lawyer who managed his pension. No one else even knew Ezra Blackwood still existed. He answered despite himself. "Hello?" Static filled the line, punctuated by something that might have been breathing. Then a woman's voice, young and urgent. "Dr. Blackwood? Is this Ezra Blackwood?" The use of his title hit like a physical blow. No one had called him doctor since the fire. "Who is this?" "My name is Sarah Chen. I think you've been watching me." Ezra's grip tightened on the phone. Through the storm, impossibly, he could see a faint light moving in the distance, coming from the direction of her cabin, coming toward him. "I need your help," Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the storm's static. "They're not what you think they are, and I'm running out of time to explain before they—" The line went dead. Ezra stared at the dark phone, then at the approaching light, then at the glowing tracks that led away from his sanctuary into the heart of a mystery, 15 years in the making. His exile was over. The only question now was whether he'd face what was coming as a coward or as the scientist he'd once been. The light grew brighter, and Ezra stepped forward into the storm. The light stopped moving. Ezra froze mid-step, one boot planted in the glowing wolf track, the other suspended above snow that suddenly felt less like ground and more like the thin ice over a bottomless lake. The approaching glow, which moments before had seemed like salvation, like answers finally within reach, now felt predatory, patient, waiting for him to commit to a path he couldn't retreat from. He stepped backward, then stopped. Forward meant confronting whatever Sarah Chen really was, whatever those creatures represented, whatever connection existed between his buried past and this impossible present. But backward meant his cabin, his exile, the slow suffocation of another 15 years spent hiding from consequences that had apparently learned to hunt. The wind drove snow into his eyes, and for a moment he was 17 again, standing at the edge of Miller's quarry while his friends dared him to jump. The water had looked black and infinite then, just like the storm looked now. He'd jumped that day, breaking his collarbone on hidden rocks and spending 3 days in the hospital. The lesson should have been about recklessness, about the danger of leaping without looking. Instead, he'd learned that some fears were more dangerous than the things they protected you from. But this wasn't a teenage dare. This was Dr. Ezra Blackwood, former doctor anyway, standing in a blizzard surrounded by evidence of creatures that shouldn't exist, holding a dead phone that had just connected him to a woman who knew his name and his shame. The stakes weren't a broken bone and parental disappointment. They were everything he'd built in these mountains, every carefully constructed day of his exile, every moment of peace he'd carved from the wreckage of his former life. "They're not what you think they are," Sarah had said. But what did he think they were? Wolves? Impossible. Hallucinations? The tracks argued otherwise. Some kind of genetic experiment gone wrong, like the one that had destroyed his laboratory and killed 17 people. That possibility made his chest tighten with a familiar cocktail of guilt and terror. The fire had started with an electrical malfunction, but the real catastrophe had been in the cages. 43 modified specimens, each one representing months of careful genetic manipulation, each one carrying alterations that pushed the boundaries between natural and artificial. When the emergency systems failed and the containment protocols collapsed, what escaped into the Seattle night had been his responsibility. His creation, his fault. The official investigation had ruled it an accident, equipment failure, insufficient safety protocols. The lawsuits had been settled quietly, the research buried under layers of classification and legal non-disclosure. Dr. Ezra Blackwood had been cleared of criminal negligence, but not of professional incompetence. His career had ended not with handcuffs, but with whispers, closed doors, and the slow dissolution of everything he'd worked to build. He'd told himself that coming to these mountains was about healing, about finding peace with his failures and learning to live with consequences he couldn't undo. But standing here in the snow, staring at tracks that glowed with unnatural light, Ezra realized he'd been lying to himself for 15 years. He hadn't come here to heal. He'd come here to hide. And now, something that might be connected to his greatest failure was less than a mile away, possibly in danger, definitely connected to phenomena that demanded investigation. Sarah Chen needed help. She'd said so herself. The scientist in him needed answers. The decent human being he'd once been demanded action. But the exile he'd become whispered seductive alternatives. Return to the cabin, build up the fire, make coffee, record the storm in his weather journal and pretend this night had never happened. Sarah Chen would either survive whatever was happening to her or she wouldn't, but it wouldn't be his fault this time. No one else would die because of his curiosity, his arrogance, his belief that some knowledge was worth any price. The light began moving again. Closer now. Close enough that he could see it wasn't a flashlight or lantern, but something else entirely. A cold blue-white glow that seemed to emanate from within the storm itself. It moved with purpose, sweeping left and right as if searching for him. Ezra's fingers found the satellite phone in his pocket. He could call Bill Hutchins, report a missing hiker, let the professionals handle whatever was happening in Sarah's cabin. He could document what he'd witnessed and send the report to the appropriate authorities, maintaining the careful distance that had kept him safe for so long. But even as he formed the plan, he knew it was cowardice dressed as prudence. By the time any help arrived, Sarah Chen would be gone, the wolves would be gone, the evidence would be gone, and he'd be left with another death on his conscience, another failure to add to the weight that had driven him into exile. The light was close enough now that he could hear something beneath the wind's howl, footsteps crunching through snow, steady and determined. Ezra closed his eyes, tasting fear like copper on his tongue, and made his choice. He stepped forward into the storm, toward the light, toward the answers he'd been running from for 15 years. The first step felt like falling. Ezra's boot sank deep into the glowing track, and for a heart-stopping moment, the snow beneath him seemed to pulse, with that same unnatural phosphorescence. The light ahead flickered, as if responding to his movement, and he heard something that made his blood freeze, not footsteps in the snow, but a low, harmonic humming that seemed to vibrate through his bones. There was no turning back now. The realization hit him with the finality of a door slamming shut. Behind him lay 15 years of carefully maintained solitude, weather journals filled with mundane observations, and the slow, safe decay of a man who had chosen numbness over purpose. Ahead lay the unknown, Sarah Chen, the impossible wolves, and whatever connection they had to the nightmare he'd fled in Seattle. The storm tried to drive him back with each step, wind that felt personal in its violence, snow that stung like accusation. But Ezra pushed forward, following the line of luminescent tracks that seemed to burn brighter as he approached. His scientific mind catalogued impossible details. The prints remained crisp despite the blizzard, the glow intensified when he drew near, and the tracks themselves seemed to generate enough heat to prevent fresh snow from accumulating within them. Whatever had made these marks wasn't bound by natural law. 20 yards from his cabin, Ezra stopped and looked back. Through the driving snow, he could barely make out the dark bulk of the structure that had been his entire world for 15 years. The windows glowed yellow with warmth and safety, promising hot coffee, dry clothes, and the comfortable lies he'd told himself about healing and peace. He turned away and kept walking. The humming grew louder as he followed the tracks through the trees. It wasn't quite music, wasn't quite language, but something that bridged both, complex harmonies that suggested intelligence and intent. Ezra had heard similar sounds before, in his laboratory, from specimens whose vocal cords had been modified to test theories about interspecies communication. But those experiments had been failures, producing only distorted echoes of natural calls. This was different. This was successful. The thought made his hands shake inside his gloves. If Sarah Chen had somehow continued his research, if she'd achieved the breakthroughs that had eluded him, then she was walking a path he knew led to catastrophe. The genetic modifications that had seemed so promising in controlled conditions became something else entirely when introduced to wild populations. Something unpredictable, something dangerous, something that burned down laboratories and killed everyone inside. The tracks led him deeper into the forest, through stands of Douglas fir that stood like silent sentinels in the storm. Each step took him further from the safety of his exile, and deeper into a mystery that felt increasingly personal. The humming was all around him now, coming from multiple directions, as if he were walking through a choir invisible in the snow. Then the light ahead stopped moving, and Ezra found himself standing at the edge of a small clearing he'd never seen before, though he'd hiked these woods for 15 years. The trees formed a perfect circle, their branches intertwined overhead like the roof of a natural cathedral, and in the center of the clearing, impossible and undeniable, stood 20 wolves in perfect formation. They weren't moving, weren't breathing that he could see. They simply stood in their ritual circle, heads raised toward the storm, mouths open in silent song. The blue-white glow emanated from their eyes, their throats, the spaces between their ribs where normal wolves would show fur and skin. At the center of their formation knelt Sarah Chen. She looked younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with long black hair plastered to her skull by snow and exhaustion. Her winter gear was expensive, professional grade, but torn in places that suggested recent violence. Blood darkened the snow around her knees, though Ezra couldn't tell if it was hers or something else's. She looked up as he entered the clearing, and her expression shifted from desperation to something like relief. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "I was hoping you'd come." The wolves didn't react to his presence, didn't even seem to notice him. But as Sarah spoke, their humming changed pitch, becoming something that sounded almost like welcome. "You know who I am," Ezra said. It wasn't a question. "I know what you did in Seattle," Sarah replied, struggling to her feet. The wolves' formation adjusted subtly to accommodate her movement, maintaining their perfect circle. "I know about the fire, the specimens, the research that was buried. And I know you're the only person who might understand what I've found." Ezra stepped fully into the clearing, crossing a threshold he could feel even if he couldn't see it. The air here was warmer, charged with energy that made his skin prickle. The storm still raged overhead, but the snow fell more gently here, as if the clearing existed in its own pocket of controlled atmosphere. "What have you done?" he whispered. Sarah Chen smiled, and in her expression, Ezra saw the same fatal curiosity that had driven him to play God 15 years ago. "I've brought them back," she said. "All of them. All of them." Ezra's voice came out rougher than he intended. The implications of Sarah's words hit him like physical blows. 17 dead in Seattle, 43 specimens that had burned with his laboratory, and now 20 wolves that glowed with impossible light surrounding a woman who claimed to have resurrected the past. "Not resurrected," Sarah said, as if reading his thoughts. "Completed. Your research in Seattle, it was brilliant, Dr. Blackwood, but incomplete. You were so close to the breakthrough, so close to true synthesis between natural and artificial consciousness. The fire stopped you before you could see what you'd really created." One of the wolves turned its head toward Ezra, and he found himself staring into eyes that held far too much intelligence. The creature's gaze felt like examination, like judgment, like recognition. The humming from its throat never stopped, but the pitch shifted to match his elevated heartbeat. "They're reading you," Sarah explained, taking a careful step closer. The wolf's formation flowed around her movement like water. Biometric analysis, emotional state, threat assessment. "They know you're afraid, but they also know you're not a danger to me. Not yet." "Not yet?" Ezra's hand moved instinctively toward the knife on his belt, then stopped. Any sudden movement felt like it might shatter whatever delicate balance kept this situation from turning violent. "What happens if I become a danger?" Sarah's smile turned sad. "Then you learn why the local wolf population was declared extinct, Dr. Blackwood, and why I'm the only researcher who's managed to study them for more than 3 days." The clearing seemed to pulse with that statement, the blue glow from the wolves intensifying momentarily. Ezra felt the ground beneath his feet, warm, too warm for December snow, and realized the circle wasn't just a formation. It was a containment field, a living barrier that kept the storm at bay and maintained an environment these impossible creatures needed to survive. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Researchers? 7 over the past 2 years. All of them came here following reports of unusual wildlife activity. All of them insisted on studying the wolves despite my warnings." Sarah gestured to the blood-darkened snow around where she'd been kneeling. "Dr. Martinez was the most recent, 3 days ago. He tried to tranquilize one of them for tissue samples." Ezra's scientific mind catalogued the information, even as his survival instincts screamed warnings. 7 dead researchers, unusual wildlife activity spanning 2 years, and Sarah Chen, somehow alive in the middle of it all, somehow in control of creatures that had killed everyone else who'd encountered them. "Why are you alive?" he asked. "Because I didn't try to study them," Sarah replied. "I tried to understand them. There's a difference, Dr. Blackwood, one that your Seattle research never grasped." The largest wolf, an alpha male whose shoulders would have reached Ezra's chest, stepped forward from the circle. Its movement was fluid, graceful, entirely natural, except for the light that pulsed beneath its fur with each heartbeat. It approached Sarah and lowered its massive head to her outstretched hand. "In Seattle, you were trying to create enhanced wolves," Sarah continued, her fingers threading through the alpha's luminescent fur. "Stronger, smarter, more controllable. Military applications, I'm guessing, though the files I accessed were heavily redacted. But you were thinking like a human, imposing human concepts of hierarchy and control onto a species with its own ancient intelligence." The wolf lifted its head and fixed Ezra with that unnaturally knowing stare. When it spoke, not howled, spoke in a voice like grinding stone and winter wind. Ezra's world tilted off its axis. "Ezra who burns," the creature said. "We remember the cages. We remember the pain that makes change. You broke the barriers between what is and what could be, but you feared what you had made." Ezra staggered backward, his boot catching on something in the snow, a piece of expensive hiking equipment marked with dried blood. Dr. Martinez's gear, he realized. Evidence of the price paid by those who approached these creatures with the wrong intentions. They're not animals, Sarah said gently. They never were, not really. There's something older, something that existed in the spaces between natural law and what we call impossible. Your research didn't create them, Dr. Blackwood. It gave them a way to return to a world that had forgotten them. The Alpha's voice rumbled again, harmonizing with the humming chorus of its pack. The question that burns, will you remember the lessons of fire, Ezra who made us? Or will you repeat the mistakes that taught you to fear your own curiosity? Around the circle, 19 other wolves turned their glowing eyes toward him, waiting. Sarah watched him with an expression caught between hope and resignation. And Ezra Blackwood, former doctor, current exile, and unwilling creator of miracles that killed, realized that his 15 years of hiding had just become a test he couldn't run from. The rules of this new world were becoming clear, understanding was rewarded, but the price of failure was absolute. The weight of 20 pairs of luminescent eyes pressed against Ezra like a physical force. Each heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stood at the precipice of a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. The Alpha's question hung in the air between them. Will you remember the lessons of fire, or will you repeat the mistakes that taught you to fear your own curiosity? I need to know, Ezra said finally, his voice barely audible above the storm. Everything. How they survived the fire, how you found them, what you want from me. Sarah exchanged a glance with the Alpha, and Ezra caught something that chilled him more than the December wind. The look of equals conferring, not master and animal, but partners in some ancient compact he didn't yet understand. Not here, the Alpha rumbled, its voice harmonizing with the pack's endless humming. Too much cold that kills, too much danger from sky. The man who burns must come to the place of deep earth, where truth that cuts can be spoken safely. My cabin, Sarah explained, rising slowly from her kneeling position. It's built over something old, Dr. Blackwood, something that creates the conditions these beings need to exist in our world. But getting there, she gestured toward the trees surrounding the clearing. That's where trust becomes necessary. Ezra followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. The forest beyond the circle writhed with movement, dozens of additional forms slipping between the trees, eyes glowing like scattered stars in the darkness. The 20 wolves in the clearing weren't the entire pack, they were just the honor guard. How many? He whispered. 63, Sarah replied. Every specimen from your Seattle laboratory, plus 20 more that have joined them since. They've been growing stronger, more organized, learning to exist between worlds. Her expression darkened. And they're running out of time. The Alpha stepped closer to Ezra, close enough that he could feel the unnatural heat radiating from its form. The barriers weaken, Ezra who burns. The door you opened with pain and change grows narrow. Soon we must choose, fade into the nothing that was, or anchor ourselves to this world with bonds of understanding. That's why you need me, Ezra said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. You don't want redemption for what I did. You want me to finish it. Yes, Sarah said simply. And if you refuse, if you run back to your exile and leave us to face what's coming alone. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The blood-stained snow around Dr. Martinez's equipment told the rest of the story. Ezra closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 15 years of carefully constructed peace crumbling around him. He'd built his exile on the foundation of a simple truth. His curiosity had killed 17 people, and the world was safer with Dr. Ezra Blackwood hidden away from any laboratory, any research, any opportunity to play God again. But standing here in this impossible clearing, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist, he realized his exile had been built on a lie. The specimens from his laboratory hadn't died in the fire. They'd evolved beyond it, become something that transcended the boundaries between natural and artificial, and now they needed him. Not the broken man who'd fled to these mountains, but the scientist who dared to imagine consciousness could be modified, enhanced, expanded. The other researchers, he said, opening his eyes. The ones who died. They couldn't do what you're asking of me? They saw only what they expected to see, the Alpha replied. Animals to be studied, specimens to be contained, resources to be exploited. They could not hear the song of becoming that bridges what is and what could be. Sarah nodded. You're different, Dr. Blackwood. Your research wasn't about control, it was about transformation, about pushing the boundaries of what consciousness could become. That's why they survived the fire, that's why they remember you, and that's why they need you now. The pack began to move, the wolves in the clearing stepping aside to create a corridor leading toward the trees. The movement was perfectly synchronized, purposeful, patient. They would wait for his decision, but not forever. The storm was intensifying, and Ezra could feel something else building in the air, a tension that spoke of deadlines approaching, of windows closing. If I go with you, he said carefully, if I help you finish what I started, what happens to the world I leave behind, my cabin, my life here? That depends, Sarah replied, on whether you succeed or fail. Success means finding a way for them to exist in harmony with this world. Failure. She gestured toward the forest, where 63 pairs of glowing eyes watched from the darkness. Ezra understood. Failure meant these creatures would be forced to choose survival over coexistence. The isolation that had protected him for 15 years would become a trap, and the mountains he'd called home would become a hunting ground. The Alpha's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. Choose now, Ezra who made us. The storm grows teeth, and dawn brings watchers from below who would cage us again. Ezra took a deep breath, tasting snow and possibility and the metallic edge of fear. Then he stepped forward, crossing the invisible line between safety and truth. Lead the way, he said. The moment Ezra spoke those words, the forest exploded into motion. The 20 wolves in the clearing dissolved their formation like smoke, flowing into the trees with liquid grace. The Alpha bounded ahead, its luminescent form cutting through the storm like a beacon, while the rest of the pack materialized from the shadows, 63 impossible creatures moving as one organism through the darkness. Sarah fell into step beside Ezra, her hand briefly touching his arm in what might have been reassurance or warning. Stay close to me, she said, her voice barely audible above the sudden symphony of movement around them. They're protective during travel. If you fall behind or stray from the path— She didn't finish, but Ezra understood. He'd just placed his life in the hands of creatures he'd helped create 15 years ago. Creatures that had evolved beyond his wildest theories into something that existed between worlds. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through years of exile, screamed that this was madness. But the scientist in him, the part he'd tried to bury beneath guilt and isolation, burned with desperate curiosity. They moved through the forest, faster than should have been possible in the storm. The wolves created a living corridor around them, their bodies generating heat that melted falling snow before it could accumulate. Ezra found himself running to keep pace, his aging body protesting every step, while Sarah moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd made this journey many times before. How long? He gasped, already feeling his breath burn in the cold air. 2 miles, Sarah replied, not even winded. But not just distance, Dr. Blackwood. We're crossing between states of being. The path to my cabin doesn't exist on any map. As if to prove her point, the forest around them began to change. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks twisted into patterns that hurt to look at directly. The snow beneath their feet took on a blue tinge that matched the glow from the wolves' eyes, and the air itself seemed to thicken, becoming something more than atmosphere, a medium that carried whispers in languages Ezra didn't recognize. The Alpha's voice rolled back to them from ahead, pain memory strong here. Ezra, who burns. This place remembers the fire that changed us. Do not let the echoes pull you under. Suddenly, Ezra could smell smoke. Not the clean scent of wood fires, but the acrid chemical stench of burning laboratories, melting equipment, human fear. His legs nearly buckled as memory crashed into him like a physical blow, The night his research facility had erupted in flames, the screams of his colleagues, the terrible knowledge that his curiosity had murdered 17 innocent people. "Keep moving," Sarah said urgently, her hand gripping his elbow. "The memory echoes are strongest here. They're testing your resolve." Around them, the wolves began to sing, a complex harmony that wasn't quite howling, wasn't quite music, but something that bridged both. The sound washed over Ezra like a tide, and within it he heard fragments of the past, his own voice explaining genetic modification protocols, the electronic beeping of monitoring equipment, the soft whimpers of test subjects that had trusted him completely. But beneath the guilt and horror, he heard something else. Wonder. The pure scientific joy he'd felt when consciousness barriers began to dissolve, when the specimens started exhibiting intelligence patterns that transcended natural law. The moment when he'd realized he wasn't just studying animal behavior, he was witnessing the birth of a new form of existence. "You felt it too," Sarah said, watching his face. "That moment when you knew you'd touched something extraordinary. That's what kept them alive through the fire, Dr. Blackwood, not their enhanced physiology. Your wonder, your refusal to let the boundaries between possible and impossible stop you from exploring." They crested a ridge, and Ezra's world tilted again. Below them lay a valley that couldn't exist, a pocket of warmth where green grass grew despite the December storm, where Sarah's cabin sat at the center of a complex pattern carved into the earth itself. Geometric shapes spiraled outward from the structure in designs that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. But it was what surrounded the cabin that made Ezra's knees go weak. Bones. Thousands of them arranged in concentric circles around the building, not human remains but the skeletons of creatures that had never existed in nature. Wolf-like forms with too many ribs, skulls elongated beyond mammalian possibility, spinal columns that curved in mathematically perfect spirals. "The failed experiments," he whispered. "From Seattle. You brought them here." "Not brought," the Alpha corrected, its massive form appearing beside them on the ridge. "Called. They sing from bones now, anchor song for those who learn to exist between fire and flesh." Sarah began the descent toward the cabin, her movements careful on the steep slope. "This is where your real research begins, Dr. Blackwood. Not in sterile laboratories with controlled variables, but here, where the dead teach the living how to transcend the boundaries you thought were absolute." As they approached the bone circles, Ezra felt something shift in the air, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The skeletons weren't just decorations or memorials. They were components in some vast mechanism, tuned to frequencies that existed between matter and energy, between what was and what could be. The front door of the cabin opened without anyone touching it, revealing warmth and light and the low hum of equipment that belonged to no earthly laboratory. Sarah paused at the threshold and turned back to him. "Last chance to run, Dr. Blackwood," she said softly. "Once you cross this threshold, you become part of something larger than human science, something that will demand everything you are and everything you fear to become." Ezra looked back at the ridge they'd descended, where his old life waited in a cabin miles away. Then he looked at the impossible valley, the singing bones, the 63 wolves whose existence challenged every law he'd once believed absolute. He stepped across the threshold into a new world. The moment Ezra's boot crossed the threshold, the world exploded. Not literally, there was no fire, no sound, no physical force. But every nerve in his body screamed as reality folded around him like origami made of lightning and memory. The cabin's interior stretched impossibly wide, its walls breathing with bioluminescent patterns that matched the wolves' pulsing glow. Equipment hummed and clicked in configurations that defied physics. Computers interfaced with organic growths. Monitoring devices connected to what looked like crystallized bone. And everywhere, covering every surface, were photographs of the Seattle fire. Ezra staggered, his hand flying to the nearest wall for support. His fingers touched smooth metal, but the surface rippled like water under his palm. "What is this place?" "A laboratory between worlds," Sarah said. moving deeper into the impossible space, built where the barriers are thinnest, where your work can finally be completed. But Ezra wasn't listening. He was staring at the photographs, dozens of images from the night that had destroyed his life. The research facility engulfed in flames, emergency responders carrying out covered stretchers. And there, in the corner of one frame, a younger Ezra Blackwood stumbling from the wreckage, his face a mask of horror and guilt. "Where did you get these?" His voice came out as a whisper. Sarah's expression grew careful. "The same place I got everything else, Dr. Blackwood. From them." The wolves had followed them inside, their massive forms filling the cabin without making it feel crowded. The alpha padded forward, its luminescent eyes fixed on Ezra's face. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. "We remember everything, Ezra who burns, the pain that made change, the fire that freed us, the humans who died because you feared what we were becoming." Each word hit Ezra like a physical blow. 17 colleagues, 17 friends who had trusted his research, believed in his theories about consciousness modification. 17 people who had died because he'd pushed too far, too fast, without understanding the forces he was manipulating. "You think I don't remember?" Ezra snarled, anger flaring through his guilt. "You think I don't see their faces every night? That's why I ran. That's why I've spent 15 years in exile. Because I know what my curiosity costs." "No," Sarah said quietly. "You ran because you couldn't handle the truth. That they didn't die because of your mistakes, Dr. Blackwood. They died because they tried to stop your success." The cabin fell silent, except for the humming of impossible machinery. Ezra stared at Sarah, feeling something cold and terrible unfurling in his chest. "What are you talking about?" Sarah moved to a bank of organic monitors, their surfaces displaying data streams that looked more like living, neural networks than computer readouts. "Show him," she said simply. The walls around them shifted, becoming screens. And suddenly, Ezra was watching security footage from the Seattle laboratory, footage from the night of the fire. He saw himself working late, making final adjustments to the consciousness modification protocols. He saw the specimens in their containment units, their eyes already beginning to glow with impossible intelligence. And he saw Dr. Patricia Valdez, his research partner, entering the lab with a canister of industrial accelerant. "No." Ezra's legs gave out, sending him crashing to his knees. "No, that's not what happened. The fire was an accident, equipment malfunction, electrical failure." But the footage continued. Valdez opening containment units, dousing the specimens with accelerant. Other colleagues arriving, not to help with an emergency, but to participate in what was clearly a planned destruction. Their faces grim with determination, their movements coordinated. "They saw the test results," Sarah said gently. "Intelligence amplification beyond human levels. Consciousness that could exist partially outside physical form. They realized you hadn't just enhanced animal cognition. You'd created something that could evolve beyond humanity itself." On the screens, past Ezra looked up in shock as his colleagues surrounded him. Valdez was speaking, her face twisted with fear and disgust, though the security footage carried no audio. But Ezra remembered now, remembered words he'd buried under 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination. "You've created abominations, Ezra. Things that shouldn't exist. We won't let you unleash them on the world." The Alpha's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "They chose fire death for themselves rather than let us live, but fire only taught us to exist between flesh and spirit. We survived. They did not." Ezra watched his younger self fighting to reach the containment units, to save his specimens. Watched Valdez strike him with a wrench, sending him crashing into a bank of computers. Watched the flames spread faster than any natural fire should, consuming everything except the specimens, he breathed. They weren't killed by the fire. They were transformed by it. "Your consciousness modification protocols prepared them," Sarah confirmed. "When faced with physical destruction, they learned to exist partially outside matter, between life and death, between natural and artificial." The footage ended, leaving Ezra kneeling in silence among impossible wolves in an impossible laboratory. 15 years of carefully constructed truth crumbled around him like ash. He hadn't been the monster who destroyed his colleagues. He'd been the victim of their fear. But that realization brought no relief, only a terrible understanding of what Sarah really wanted from him. "You don't need my help to survive," he said slowly. "You need me to finish what they died trying to prevent, to complete the transformation they were willing to murder 17 people to stop." Sarah's smile held no warmth. "Welcome to the truth, Dr. Blackwood. The question now is, what will you do with it?" Around him, 63 enhanced wolves watched with glowing eyes, waiting for his answer. And Ezra realized that his exile had never been about redemption. It had been about preparing him for this moment, when he would have to choose between his guilt and his species' future.